Hi everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's roundtable discussion on practical ways to support the well-being of frontline staff. And I'm here with colleagues Rachel Marshall, Kate Standing and Oliver Townsend, who will be introducing themselves shortly. So to introduce myself, my name is Brett Gellier. I'm a counselling psychologist and the founder of BGPS, which is an organisation of psychotherapists, counsellors and psychologists that provide psychological services for the homeless sector. That includes reflective practice sessions, which have been demonstrated to improve staff well-being and resilience and to reduce the impact of stress. And prior to starting BGPS, I implemented staff wellbeing programs in NHS departments. So that's a bit about me. And then let me introduce you to Rachel.
Hi there, afternoon everyone. I'm Rachel Marshall. I work at St Martin in the Fields charity as policy and best practice manager. And as part of that work, I lead on our research with frontline workers. So we do an annual survey which talks a lot about wellbeing on the frontline and what works and what are the challenges. So I'm here to share a bit of insight from that.
Lovely, thanks Rachel. And Kate?
Yeah, so hi, my name is Kate Standing. I work for Justlife, which is an organisation that provides support to people in emergency and temporary accommodation, and we have a national research and policy team. But we also sort of run the Brighton and Hove Frontline sort of network. So I'm here in that capacity, and I'll share a little bit more about what we've been doing in Brighton and Hove a bit later.
Lovely, thanks Kate. And Oliver?
Hi, my name's Oliver. I'm head of connections and change at Platfform. Platform's a South Wales-based mental health and housing charity. So we work with people who need housing-related support, but also much more widely, we support young people. And my role is to campaign and challenge systems so that we can make the system work better for frontline staff and the people we support.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Oliver. And so the four of us are going to provide some brief presentations, about 8 minutes each. And at the end, we're going to answer some questions that have come previously from the audience and any questions that come up as we go through the presentation. So please put any questions you might have in the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many of those at the end. So I'm ready for the first slide, please, Josh. Thanks very much. So we're talking about well-being, and well-being has 5 main areas that contribute to a sense of well-being, feeling that everything is okay in the world and feeling mainly positive about oneself and one's relationships. And so a key element of well-being is positive emotion. That's not to say we need to be cartwheeling down the street every day. It's more about having a balance of emotions, which would also include negative emotions, but the positive emotions would be joy, warmth, connection, happiness. So it's having a good dose of positive emotion every day. Engagement, which is feeling as though you're in flow when you're doing what you're doing, whether it's your work or hobbies or socializing. It's also important for us humans to have a sense of meaning, to feel that what we're doing has some kind of purpose. And of course, those of us who work in the homeless sector, you know, our work has an awful lot of meaning, and we're helping and empowering people in our work. And we also need to have a sense of accomplishment. So just small accomplishments, you know, getting a report written or accompanying someone to an appointment, and the larger accomplishments, so passing a course of study or finishing a larger project, are all important. And of course, we're social creatures, and so positive relationships are really important, which include getting on with our colleagues, getting on with the wider systems around us. Thanks, Josh. Next slide. But as we all know, we experience stress. So stress is a physiological response to perceived and real threats to our well-being and our safety. And we all understand the stress response, which is increased heart rate, shallow breathing, maybe shaking, feeling sick, more extreme stress. And over time, if our system, our body is in stress response over a period of time, it lowers our immunity and leaves us susceptible to all sorts of mental and physical difficulties. So managing our stress is very important. Some key stressors might be workload, illness, conflict, money worries. I think there's going to be talk about the cost of living crisis later on, family issues. And then the idea is that well-being, so the things we do to improve our well-being, helps to reduce the stress levels in our stress bucket. So all these stressors fill up our stress bucket over the days and over the weeks, and our well-being is the tap that helps to reduce the volume in that stress bucket. So things that we're going to be talking about today and later this afternoon. So next slide, thank you. And so some of you may have come across these concepts already, but they've really come to the fore really since during and since the pandemic, and with the austerity that we've been living under for the last decade. And so these two concepts, the idea of systemic betrayal is the feeling of distress and stress that we feel when the institutions that we expect are there to hold us and support us in society are failing in different ways. So, for example, I work in quite a few different hostels, and I get told that the fire brigade just don't show up anymore, or the ambulance takes 2 hours, or referrals to social care just get rejected. It's almost impossible to get anyone into the mental health system. And it's not to blame any of these systems. We all understand they're all under pressure, but this breaks a perceived social contract, and it causes a sense of distress for us. So moral injury is related to systemic betrayal. And so moral injury is more about internalized guilt, where we're forced into making least bad decisions. So, for example, during the pandemic, asking, well, at any time, making a decision to evict someone or asking someone to leave an accommodation for a while could be one example of that. Or because of the rules and the expectations, that you're not able to act within your moral and ethical code. And so that can cause a sense of moral injury and distress, which adds again to our stress bucket. So next slide, please. So we're talking this afternoon in this roundtable discussion about the impact of managers and what managers and leaders within the homeless sector can do to support the well-being of their staff members. And so this very recent research shows that 60% of employees worldwide say their job is the biggest factor influencing their mental health, and managers have as much impact on a person's mental health as their spouse. That's 69%. So any of you who are leaders in any capacity really have the power and the possibility to make a real difference in the frontline workers' lives. So I think we all know this working in this sector, but 81% of employees worldwide would prioritize good mental health over a high-paying job. The next slide. So just, I want to say something briefly, thinking about different areas of research and how, as leaders and colleagues as well in the homeless sector, what can we do to reduce the stress and increase the sense of well-being? And compassion is really a key here. And so compassion has two psychologies or two elements to it. The first is about recognizing distress, recognizing when someone is not feeling good or someone is struggling in some way. And then the second part is then, having recognized that, having a deep desire to alleviate that suffering. And so the Roffey Park Institute have come up with this graphic to think about the process within the workplace. So first of all, we want to be alive to the suffering of other people. You know, how might our colleagues be struggling, or how might your line managers be struggling? Can we listen, really listen non-judgmentally and understand what that struggle's about? And we might want to push it away. We might feel distressed because we can't fix it straight away, so we try to push it away. But what we really want to do is tolerate our own personal distress, regulate our own emotion, and show empathy to that person, and then take appropriate action. And so this is a model for leaders and colleagues and all of us in the sector to be helping to increase the well-being of our colleagues. So next slide, please. Almost finished. Am I in my 8 minutes, or do I need to race a little bit? Okay, I need to race. That's the message I'm getting. So the compassionate leadership is a good thing. So people following this model, there's evidence that the staff well-being increases, errors reduce, and that as leaders, you know, we shape the culture. Culture's how we do things, why we do things the way we do, and this is a powerful influence. And so, what are the leadership behaviours that lend themselves to compassionate leadership? They are being authentic, being real, open, honest, humble, curious, optimistic, appreciative of people, and compassionate. Next slide. So this, next slide, please, Josh. Thank you. And so this guidance from the National Institute of Clinical Excellence is from 8 years ago now, but it still stands. And these are the areas of management practice to improve employees' health and well-being. And this fits quite well with the idea of psychologically informed environments and trauma-informed care. I'm just want to briefly touch on monitoring and evaluation in the next slide before I hand over to Rachel. So really what we want to do, and to take a scientific approach, is we want to evaluate whether the initiatives that we're implementing in the workplace are actually effective. Lots of ways of doing this. We can do staff surveys. There are management competency frameworks that we can look into. And then we can also measure very specific things like well-being, whether people feel that they have efficacy or they feel like they're effective in their work. And then you can also measure burnout. And so you can look at changes over a period of time based on the interventions you've decided to implement to improve well-being in the workplace. So I'll be quiet now and hand over to Rachel for her presentation.
Thanks very much, Brett. So I'm going to take this opportunity to just give a short summary of some of the findings that came through about frontline worker wellbeing in our latest survey. So if we move on to the next slide, we heard from over 1,000, so 1,182 frontline workers. So if you yourself participated, a massive thank you, because we use this evidence both for our own activities and kind of planning this conference, but also to share with decision makers. So thanks to everyone who took part. And it was responses from across the UK, from people in a really wide variety of roles, 1 in 5 of whom had also experienced homelessness themselves. And you can see in this chart the types of services people were responding from. So everything from supported housing, advice services, resettlement or tenancy sustainment. So I'll move on to sharing some of the things that we heard about experiences of frontline homelessness work. So moving on to the next slide, I think the kind of upshot here was that, and this survey was November, December last year, so particularly kind of heading into the winter in quite a difficult climate. The feedback that we got was that frontline staff are working under extremely challenging conditions, both in terms of seeing rising demand for their services, that affecting the amount of time they have for things that are really important, such as training. We heard a lot about the impact of the cost of living, both on people accessing support, being in really concerning situations, but also on frontline staff themselves. So this kind of last statistic on the slide, 32% of frontline workers stated that they themselves were struggling to pay housing costs. So it's a really difficult context that people are working within. And moving on to the next slide, we can see that this is having an impact on staff wellbeing. So the majority of staff felt that their role actually had a negative impact on their wellbeing. And we're seeing that, whilst a lot of staff remain really committed to working in this sector, actually got really passionate, really dedicated, competent, fantastic staff members who are uncertain about their future in this sector. And that's for a range of reasons around the difficulties of this job. And people often, again, made links here to the rising cost of living. So you can see in this quote, someone saying, it's hard to support people when you're also struggling to keep the wolf from the door. So then moving on to talk a little bit about some of the action that frontline workers recommended when we asked them in the survey. So I think they kind of fell into two parts. So this first part is really about acting immediately and quickly to support people and frontline services in this cost of living crisis. So there was an overwhelming majority of people supporting the need to help services through this cost of living crisis. And that looked like a few different things. Services are seeing increasing costs, whether that's energy costs, fuel costs for frontline workers going out and about in the community, other things like their funding hasn't increased, but perhaps salaries they're wanting to uplift in line with inflation. So a whole manner of things that need to be resourced so that frontline services are under less pressure. And then the second part, if we move on to the next slide, is kind of a bigger piece around supporting frontline workers and improving the conditions and making sure that they have the tools they need to do their jobs effectively, and therefore be offering the best support they can to people facing homelessness. So we had a whole range of wider recommendations that came through here that I'll just overview now, but I'm sure we'll delve into a bit later in the session. And these came around working conditions, so things like pay, job security, the ability to be flexible if that's useful to people, also things around opportunities for training. So both kind of training on particular topics, whether that's something like immigration advice or housing legislation, but also more soft skills, whether that's leadership, and linking to the point made about managers having such an important role in supporting other people's well-being, or kind of soft skills like resilience, that kind of thing. And then kind of fundamentally, we come back to this point that frontline workers also wanted to see wider change, reform, policy changes to prevent homelessness, kind of where they could see opportunities that were being missed, where they were kind of frustrated that there were things that were not enabling them to do their jobs and kind of prevent homelessness before it happened. They really wanted to see change, and we explore that a lot more in a kind of separate report that I won't go into now. But I think this kind of last quote hits the nail on the head in terms of investing into staff, ensuring that services are kind of stable, can plan and act preventively, rather than kind of feeling like they're firefighting and not able to get to the root of the issue or kind of provide the best support to people facing homelessness. So I think we've just got one more slide, which is to say you're very welcome to read more. On our website, we've got a lot more detail about some of the research that I've mentioned, but I'll leave it there as a bit of a context piece for now, and I'll hand over to the speakers.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So I think we're hearing from Kate now.
I think it might be me.
Oh, Oliver, sorry.
That's all right.
Oliver.
No, that's all right. Unless well, both me and Kate would get a shock trying to deliver each other's presentations, so I'll try not to do that. So yeah, I just want to introduce Platform very quickly. So Platform, we're a mental health and social change charity. If we move on to the next slide, we have been going for 30 years, and our current vision, we've changed a lot over the last few years. Our current vision is around actually working to change the system rather than just deliver services in it. And everything is underpinned by our values, which we and all of our staff share around being connected, compassionate, curious, and brave. Next slide, please. So I won't actually, next slide again. So we've been working for 30 years. That's led us to see a lot of problems in the mental health system, not just kind of structural problems, but also kind of challenges to the way we think about mental health, challenges that we want to make to the kind of accepted traditional norms. So our mission is quite simple, simply described, not simply done. One is to change that dominant narrative around mental health, and the other is to make our helping systems work better for people. Next slide. So this is a picture probably some of you have seen several hundred times, and some of you may have only seen today. And this is essentially our mental health system. We have a group of people who have been traumatized by a failure in society through either trauma, poverty, or discrimination. And we, as professionals, will give people a label or a diagnosis or medication or a medicalized approach, rather than actually say, let's take a wider societal look at what is causing or what is creating the conditions necessary for that to take root. Next slide, please. So at its very simplest, mental health, we believe, is nervous system regulation plus our connection with the self, others, and the world. And what that looks like for each of us is very different. Next slide. So I'm rushing through these. So this is just meant to give you a flavour about the sort of things we talk about at Platform, and hopefully more will come out in the Q&A. But you've obviously, I imagine, seen this thousands of times, not just hundreds of times. And this is not a exact, this is just a model, a framework to help us understand the way our mind works. It's not a direct biological replica of the brain. So, but essentially what this is saying is that most of us will spend our lives several times a day, however often it is, we oscillate between being in a healthy state for engagement and being overwhelmed. Now, the example I often use is I'm currently presenting. I'm feeling quite nervous because I can see there's 123 people watching, and yeah, so I've got slight nerves there. And so I'm currently bouncing around between nervousness and being able to talk about some relatively complex things. How well I'm doing, I'm not sure, but we'll see. Now, if suddenly there was a massive tarantula crawling towards me on the desk, I would go right into fight or freeze, and there's absolutely no way I would be able to use the words dorsal vagal. I would probably be using much less salubrious words. So that, for me, is an example of how very quickly you can be overwhelmed, and it's really hard for you to communicate or engage. Now, for a lot of people, I can then come out of that. I can either run away from the spider so I can't see it. I can take some assertive actions to reduce or remove the spider from my life, or I can do whatever it is that takes that away. There are some people, because of the situations, whether it's poverty, whether it's lack of relationships, whether it's attachment challenges, people will find it really hard to come out of that state of overwhelm. And once that happens for a long period of time, you can find yourself stuck in it. And often that is then labeled or medicalized. So what we're trying to understand here is actually mental health is our ability to connect to others. So like in the previous slide, that is what mental health is essentially predominantly appearing as. Next slide. And a lot of that is based around how our attachment cycle works. So this is around 70 to 100 years of attachment theory distilled into one diagram. So the full caveat: this is not a comprehensive perspective on attachment. However, what it is saying is that as young people, as children, we require that secure base and that safe haven to leave from and come back in on. And if something disrupts that, if we don't have that in a sustained way, we find it really hard to, for example, the most important point here is at the bottom of the safe haven, you can see organize my feelings. So if you've grown up scared of your feelings, you don't understand your feelings, you've never learned how to organize them, label them, put a name to them, learn what they fear, then very often it's really hard to cope with those feelings. So if you think back to the earlier slide where you're stuck in that sense of overwhelm, not only are people stuck in it, they often don't know what it actually is. So people feel very dysregulated and find it really hard to connect to others. And attachment can happen and does happen throughout our adult life. It's not just something that happens when you're a child. It's the conditions are created when you're a child, but it is possible to reset or change the way you think about attachment. And often the attachment is then replicated as you're an adult in your adult relationships as well. Next slide, please. I'll skip this, but this is essentially trying to capture all of that it's not just the attachment of the individual that causes the problems, it's the social determinants. So if you find yourself, if you've grown up in a family that has not had that sustained attachment, or if you grow up in a community with high levels of poverty, if community centres are closed down, if the ambulances don't turn up in that area of the community more than others, then you start to get both individual trauma, but what's a growing view is adverse community experiences, adverse community traumas. And that makes it really hard for communities themselves to gather around and heal as well. And the important thing that I wanted in terms of this presentation is communities can be organisations, they can be local communities, or they can be online communities. However we want to define communities, each community can have its own adverse experiences. So potentially, and we've heard a lot from the Frontline network about your report, we as homelessness, mental health sectors, we have our now own shared community trauma from all of these things that are happening to us and the people that we are supporting. Next slide, please. So we need to dig deeper. We need to understand what it is that's causing our mental health challenges, the problems, the overwhelm in the system. And we do that by digging deeper to understand some of these deep-rooted challenges, which we can't fix as organisations on our own. Next slide. Next slide as well. That's just one less message to leave you with. Again, this will come out in the conversation. So we'll be talking more about how do we move to trauma prevention, how do we help ourselves regulate and connect, and how do we avoid that nervous system dysregulation, which keeps it in that overwhelming space. And then next slide as well. And next slide. There we go. So this is what we are looking to do at Platform, is to use the model of attachment around our employees. So where we are working with employees who are dealing with overwhelmed people and are themselves overwhelmed, we need to start replicating that positive attachment, that secure and safe attachment within the workplace, which is very similar to what Brett was saying in terms of the compassionate leadership. But a lot of that also has to be taken to the perspective of a wider social challenge of increased poverty, of lack of housing, and the fact there isn't a huge amount of gap, a huge gap between the people we support and the people at the front line. People are often in positions of poverty, positions of overwhelm, and we need to reflect that reality before we can do anything that will actually help people's well-being. And I think if you can skip the next few slides, because I've run out of time, that's definitely a whistle-stop tour. The final thing I'll leave you with before I pass on to Kate is the idea of moving at the speed of trust. So within Platform at the moment, we are trying to make our changes slowly and surely to make sure that we're moving more to towards that safe attachment way of working, but it takes time. And for a lot of people working on the front line, we might not be moving fast enough. For some people, we might be moving too fast. So one of the things we're trying at Platform is moving at the speed of trust, building relationships, working relationally, rather than trying to convince and persuade people to follow a particular model. And that is that. Thank you very much. And I'll pass over to Kate. And thank you for bearing with me.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Oliver. You know, some of those images, the koala, and then the dig deeper, you know, there's so much more powerful, isn't it? Seeing it in an image and a picture, so impactful. Thank you. And Kate.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to start with just like the why am I here? I've sort of worked as a frontline worker sort of on and off for many a years. So part of this is almost like my own sort of journey as well, and just and how sort of support sort of the well-being of sort of staff is just so important. So some of the things I'm just going to talk through is about, yeah, so you'll sort of see from the heading there, it's about becoming psychologically and trauma informed from the ground up. So that's just as a bit of a theme that we've been working on in sort of Brighton and Hove sort of over the last little while. So and I'll sort of weave in how that relates to sort of worker well-being. So next slide, please. So there's just a little bit of an overview of the Brighton Hove Frontline Network. So we've been running since 2017, and we just run regular events and actually had monthly sort of newsletters and things. I think there's a bit of text sort of missing off that. And and it would quite sort of a broad group of sort of frontline sort of workers that are from the community voluntary sort of sector, but also we have sort of workers from the housing department, health, the DWP sort of come along, and so I just thought it's just helpful just to sort of like to pause and think about when we're talking about frontline workers in this sector. It actually is very sort of a wide sort of landscape of different sort of workers and organisations and different sort of models and ways of working. So yeah, so I just thought that just sort of help just to show that. Next slide, please. So as I say, we've been running since 2017, and actually one of the key things that's almost been sort of, and again from the ground up, so sort of pre-pandemic sort of times and things, was workers from, because we very much sort of like want to hear from local sort of workers in the city of Brighton and Hove, and what sort of topics and things that they want us to sort of focus on and sort of and talk about, and the idea of sort of like almost like worker well-being and support has been almost like a golden thread that's run through all the work that we've done. But these are some of the key themes that have just been popping up, sort of lots of the trauma-informed care and psychologically informed environments and all these various other things, and they also feel like they sit under, and there's a lot of interrelation sort of between them, and I think the common sort of theme is around sort of that culture. What I really particularly like is around the psychologically informed environments, is to help us sort of understand that, because that talks about a framework, and one of the key pieces of the framework is around staff training and support, and so we've been doing a lot of sort of talks sort of locally and sort of in sort of different sort of spaces and things just around that, but also through the general sort of, and that's where sort of reflective practice comes in, and even just ways of sort of working. So some of those sort of things listed might be sort of familiar sort of terms to you, and I'd say just on our sort of journey sort of locally sort of here, sort of feeling there's a lot of interconnection between those. Next slide, please. Again, this is just a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the things that we've been sort of doing, but how do we sort of connect sort of together? So like I say, we host sort of events and workshops and things, and actually more just spaces to share experience, really. I think it's I think I see myself as very much a gatherer of people and ideas, and just giving people space to do that. So another sort of thing, also we do sort of host sort of training and things, but again on our sort of journey, it's being creative with that. And actually I think I prefer the word sort of learning. How do we learn? So it's not necessarily so when we're looking at sort of the skilled sort of worker, and having for workers to have the tools that they need to do the job they need to do. And this is again with being sort of trauma informed and psychologically informed, but it's not necessarily going to just a training sort of session. It's actually how do you sort of, you maybe sort of learn from peers and learn from other sort of colleagues. So just thinking about that, and I'm hoping that maybe some of the things that I'm talking about, some of the things that we're doing here in Brighton, you might be able to sort of just sort of think about your own sort of areas and where there are sort of points of sort of connecting that you might be sort of looking at, and actually how does this tap into sort of how we're sort of like focusing on sort of the well-being of the workforce. Another thing I sort of send out as regular sort of newsletters, and that often sort of being really brief and focused, because also just really mindful that people are time poor, and so just trying to get the right bits of information to the right sort of people. I did there as well around sort of just email sort of conversations, and sometimes when we sort of looking at sort of how the work that we sort of do in sort of just sort of reaching out to different people, it's some of these big things, the events and stuff like that, but actually don't underestimate the power of just those connections with colleagues across, sort of across the sector. And sometimes it's that taking just an extra couple of minutes just to sort of have those sort of conversations, and those can sort of build on your own sort of well-being as well. And I think we're sort of talking about that sense of sort of a community and sort of mutual sort of support, and then do tend to connect with other sort of networks and conversations with sort of people sort of locally and nationally. And obviously Rachel was sort of sharing around sort of like the national sort of Frontline Network sort of annual sort of survey. Again, locally we've been, I know organisations that have used that and tapped into that and to see the bigger picture, and sometimes it helps us to identify in a local sort of area sort of what are the priorities, and you realise, oh yes, that is actually sort of an issue that's up and down the country, and maybe we can sort of join forces, or that sort of things that we can sort of put more energy sort of into. Next slide, please. this again is just very quick, sort of just again the who, when I was just sort of sharing sort of earlier about, actually it's a really sort of broad group of different sort of people, that when we talk about sort of that landscape of those sort of working in homelessness and homelessness prevention, it can be sort of like wider than you think, and I think again in some of these sort of conversations and ideas about how do we sort of develop and support sort of the workforce, it's often just that finding your allies, and just and working with that and building on those sort of connections. Next slide, please. And my last sort of thing, I just wanted to impart that it is a journey. So there's just look for those opportunities for conversations and learning. So like I say, not just focusing on sort of traditional training sort of necessarily. And again, I think some of the trainings of things that we've sort of helped facilitate, what works really well is then having those spaces for discussion as well. So sometimes it's about, and that's thinking that if you're sort of thinking of going on particular training on a sort of topic that maybe sort of support you in your work, it's also then thinking about afterwards, well, how do I create some space to, how do I work out how to apply that, and I think that can work really well. You can sort of bring things back. I know again locally we have sort of workers that go on sort of training and they go back to their teams and within team meetings, and we sort of do that quite a lot within Justlife, and then we sort of share our learning and then look how do we apply that in our own sort of spheres of influence and things. Also just to say that value of facilitating sort of spaces and building networks. I mean, I'm in a really privileged position where this is my role, so I can just sort of reach out to different organisations across the city. But I suppose it's just for sort of individual workers or managers to just look at when in your sort of areas of sort of work, if there's an opportunity to sort of build those sort of spaces and network and trust, you know, or maybe sort of collaborating together and sort of getting some training in sort of together, or just having sort of a joint sort of team meeting where you perhaps sort of focus on something. And then just sort of realizing the different approaches and there are different points of sort of contact to reach that widest sort of number. Because again, some of the things that we're looking at are almost like the whole system sort of change within the city. So I think certainly something that I've sort of been learning on this journey it is again that consistency of approach and a general culture sort of change. We've had some really amazing sort of meetings and conversations with different workers from different organisations where, for example, we talked about reflective practice, because obviously lots of people talking about reflective practice, but what does that actually sort of mean, and how do different organisations might be able to apply that in different ways? So it might be you have a clinical psychologist coming in externally to sort of facilitate a group, but actually to pause and think, gosh, actually, do we do that within our teams anyway? And maybe, you know, you sort of come in from a visit with somebody you're sort of supporting, and you just sort of share with a colleague and just like how that sort of went, and you just chew it over and just think, oh, did I do that? Which bits could I sort of have done better? And just to remember that those sorts of things and those spaces are really really sort of valuable when we again looking about our own sort of well-being and sort of when we're doing a really difficult job. So it might not always be massive sort of changes within your organisations. It's sometimes just being able to just pause and think about perhaps what you are doing that really does make a difference to your sort of well-being and the quality of the support you're able to provide, and just make sure you hang on to it. Next slide, please. I think that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I really got the sense there, you know, at the beginning, you were saying when we think about frontline workers, we're talking about quite a diverse group of people working in homelessness, with health, with DWP. And I was thinking also about people who work with those who are seeking asylum. Yet I've really got a sense of your organisation and you wanting to bring people together in spaces where they could, you know, have a shared voice and think about the commonalities and find solutions together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a real richness in that's what's been absolutely amazing, and where, like I say, I feel like been a real privilege to be able to sort of be in a role where you can just gather people from a whole range of different organisations. Quite often it's not unusual at an event to sort of have people from about 10, 15 different organisations. And when we get feedback, it's often around, oh, you know, it was really lovely sort of to network, to connect up with people, to put sort of faces to names and things like that. And so obviously I can do that within a frontline network sort of area of work sort of in our local area. But I'm sure there are ways that, yeah, again, other people can apply that in their own areas. And it's just lovely.
That's really lovely. And, you know, linking back to that first slide about the elements of well-being, you know, you're providing opportunities for engagement, connection, positive relationships. And so let's move on to the questions. We've got some which I think were sent in to the people at the Frontline Network previously, and I can see we've got one question so far on the Q&A. So please, if you've got more questions, put those into the Q&A section. Let's start off with, I know we've kind of answered this already, but if I could ask Rachel, Kate and Oliver, how can we create opportunities to foster elements of positive well-being in our day-to-day work?
I don't mind coming in first, and then
yeah.
So I think one of the things that I was going to be saying in the slides was I don't think there is anything we can fundamentally do that will shift the tide against the social change we're seeing. So against that backdrop, this is going to sound a bit bleak, but I'll get somewhere, I promise. It's really difficult to just well-being our way out of what is fundamentally a crisis of services, or rather funding and support of services. And actually, one of the things that we find at Platform is a loss of hope is the most paralysing, difficult thing to deal with. So a lot of what we're trying to do at Platform is connect the work that people are doing with a sense of hope and agency over the things that they feel out of control with. So things like a lack of funding, things like the way services are structured, things like the way that commissioners can sometimes design and procure services can leave people feeling absolutely hopeless. And when people are feeling hopeless, it's really hard to have any kind of well-being intervention that will meet that. So in that sense, by being together with people, by being honest with people, and by linking people in with kind of campaigns and influencing work, and actually seeing that the struggles they're having will actually mean something, is one of the things we're doing within Platform to try and shift that dial a little bit. And I thought I'd just drop that in the beginning, because I think that's probably where we're focusing on, and where a lot of my presentation comes from, is you change the conditions and give people agency and hope, and actually a lot of the other things will then be given space to take effect.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. And I think, you know, that is a really key issue. We can't ignore the social context in which we're operating at the moment, and it is pretty bleak. But at the same time, I think, as you're describing there, we have to balance it. We have to honour the fact, recognise the fact that we're working in incredibly difficult circumstances at the moment, but there are still things we can do. And when you were speaking, I was thinking about that idea of learned helplessness, where you feel, what options are there out for us, and we give up altogether looking for solutions, whereas there are little chinks of hope out there, which sounds like you're really focusing on with Platform. And there's activism, and something that can be quite, you mentioned as well, which is one of the other questions, agency and control. The evidence around resilience suggests that it's not so much the stress or the severity of what we're going through. It's more about how much can we predict what's going to happen next, and how much control do we have in our immediate sphere. And actually, if we can focus on what we can control and what we can predict, then actually that does an awful lot for our well-being, and it enables us to get through difficult times. Is there anything that Kate or Rachel you'd like to add maybe to that first question, or as soon as we started talking about the importance of agency and control, about those?
I was going to sort of chip in, I suppose, yeah, because it feels like there needs to be like a multi sort of pronged approach, because there's things. So some things I was sort of focusing on are things that perhaps people can sort of do on the ground within their sort of spheres of influence, and things they can potentially sort of have some control over. But it is also recognizing that we are in really sort of challenging times. And again, I'm sort of hearing a lot around sort of staff recruitment and retention being really sort of you know, a lot of organizations struggling with that, which then makes you then start to think about what about this, you know, the workers that are in those services that are maybe having to carry that sort of load and cover extra shifts and things. And I think that's again where sort of the National Frontline sort of Networks sort of annual survey can be a really useful tool to help, and actually, and also sort of the whole, like I said, the PI framework I find sort of useful, and I think sort of Robin Johnson, who coined the term, he sort of shared that it gives you a language to describe what you're often already doing. And I think, yeah, like I say, having worked in the sector for a long time sort of now, I found that really sort of useful to then be able to describe to potential funders and decision makers, this is what we do, we are an incredibly skilled sort of workforce, and it takes time, and some of these frameworks that we sort of, and ways of working, we can sort of describe. It says, you know, these things about building trust and relationship with those that we're supporting, that takes time. We can't have massive sort of caseloads, and although, yeah, it might take time for some of that information and to sort of filter through to those decision makers. I think, you know, there are some of those sort of vehicles that we can sort of do that. And so at the moment, it perhaps feels that, yeah, it's really sort of challenging, but I also feel hopeful that we have now got these channels that perhaps we didn't sort of have before. And again, actually at Justlife, so we're a relatively sort of small organisation, but we have, yeah, like I said, policy and sort of research, and sort of almost like campaigning sort of arm as well. So we're doing the stuff on the ground, and sort of, and then that is informing sort of, you know, what some of the issues are. So then we can start articulating that and try and sort of like make sort of a difference and try to sort of advocate for sort of systemic change.
That's excellent. And yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that, and the great job that the Frontline Network does in terms of collecting data and then collating and disseminating research. It's such an important part of the work. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. I think definitely there are things that individuals and kind of organizations can do and change in terms of their culture or the processes or policies they have in place that can affect well-being. I think there's a kind of also a piece around how can we collectively make the case that the well-being of frontline staff is really important. And, you know, we heard in the Frontline Workers survey that the majority of staff think when they've got poor well-being, that directly affects the support they're able to give to people. And so when we're talking to funders, commissioners, policymakers, we need to be getting that message across that it's not a nice to have, that we're looking after us like workforce. It will directly impact our ability to end homelessness. And so to really be putting that kind of collectively across and getting that message out, so that some of those bigger picture, the systems issues around resourcing and kind of capacity get tackled, as well as things that, you know, we ourselves can do, things that we need to lobby for, really.
Thank you, Rachel. Excellent. And so shall we take a question from the audience that we've got with us right now? Let's have a look. Okay, so this is quite a nice one. Can the panelists share a tip or trick they found useful when feelings of defeatedness and frustration set in? So I guess something, first of all, just to mention about that, it's a really good question, because sometimes, you know, we're looking at the bigger picture, but on a day-to-day basis, when you're really overwhelmed by negative emotion, we need something to pick ourselves back up again in order to, you know, continue with our work and engage with the people we're there to support. You know, I think the first thing that's quite important is probably mindfulness. You know, we hear a lot about mindfulness, but if we can practice becoming self-aware and we notice I'm feeling defeated and I'm feeling frustrated, then we've got a little space between the feeling and our awareness of it. And then there's I don't know if you come across this concept of reification, which is a bit of a jargony psychological word, but basically it means that as humans, whichever state we're in, we have a tendency to believe it's going to last forever. So when we're joyful, it's going to be like this forever. When we're feeling down, oh my God, it's always been like this and it's always going to be like this. So just being aware this won't last forever. You know, this may feel like it's going to last forever right now, but I know emotions come and go, and let me ask myself in 15 minutes time if I'm still feeling the same. So that's my tip. Sorry to take the easiest one, mindfulness. So that's my tip. Who would like to give a tip next?
I don't mind sharing. I'm very much a team player, and I'd say obviously being in a strong team and sharing with your with your colleagues, I think, and just almost debriefing and just a bit of spending the time to sort of build that trust and those sort of relationships, I think could be really sort of helpful. That's definitely sort of carried me through some sort of challenging or sort of frustrating sort of times during my career, as being part of a really good strong team and fostering that culture.
Wonderful. Yeah, sharing, debriefing, building the team culture. Lovely, thank you. Oliver, you look like you might be about to say something.
I was hoping that you wouldn't call me, but yeah, that's a really challenging question, I think, because so how do I do that? And I think it's different because I'm a manager and I work now predominantly in kind of policy and influencing. I used to manage a service, but so for me, I'm not religious, but I often turn to the Serenity Prayer, just as an idea of, I can never remember it, even though I use it a lot. The courage to accept what I can't change, and then the wisdom to know the difference. And it's about working out what you can control and what you can't. But there's also a wonderful quote which Martin Luther King had, which is something like, you can tell I'm really bad at quotes, apologies, I shouldn't try and use them. He said, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think one of the tips I do, thank you, Naomi, sharing it in the chat, the prayer. So one of the things I do when I'm feeling overwhelmed or really despairing is step back and think, actually, what has changed in our society over the last 100 years? So as a gay man, for example, just growing up in the 90s, I've already seen the amazing changes in that area, the sense of progress, the sense of equality, the sense of embracing of my identity in life. So for me, that gives me hope. And again, and I know I've said this in the earlier question, but hope is the absolute critical thing. If we don't have hope as human beings, it's impossible to find any kind of connection to anyone, because there's no point. That is how our brains will work. So for me, it's how do I keep hope? That's probably the real question. And I keep hope by connecting to people. I keep hope by talking to people. And I keep hope by trying to keep perspective. I have to say, though, it's really tricky because I'm speaking from a position of privilege as a manager. I'm not on the breadline. I'm not struggling in terms of income or cost living any more than kind of other people are, I suppose, in that sense. And I think that's where I have to just be putting as much effort as I can be in making sure that the teams I work with understand it's safe to reach out for help. So that's a really long answer, but I suppose it's because I can't give tips. I think that's probably and I'm not attacking the questioner with this, I hope that doesn't come across, but I've been at some training in the past where we have talked a lot about resilience, and I remember someone saying once, make a bridge stronger. You can't keep putting, if your bridge, if it feels like it's about to collapse, make your foundations really strong and really build the bridge up so it doesn't collapse. And I remember just sitting there completely switching off and thinking, no, we need to make sure that we stop putting weight on the blooming bridge. So that's where I always come back to, is let's change the conditions so that we don't have to always think about how to stop our support workers or frontline workers from burning out, because that can't be healthy in the long run.
Thank you so much, Oliver.
It was a good question, but yeah, really
good question. And so that idea of hope, seeing the bigger picture, the wider historical lens really helps as well. Seeing how things have changed over a period of time, not just this recent decade. I really like that you can probably see the anonymous attendee has put there, it's so important to celebrate the achievements and the positive outcomes, because every single day there are people who are achieving, who are moving on in their recovery, who are making differences in their lives. And so, those are the things we witness every day, and so important to celebrate achievements when we're dealing with, lots of stresses. Yeah, really good. Shall I go on, Rachel? Do you want to add something?
I guess just briefly, I completely agree with everything that's been said. I guess my reflection from reading like Frontline Workers survey responses is that it will kind of vary for everybody in terms of what is useful to them, and it might vary on the circumstances of frustration as well. So we've had everything from the spectrum of, you know, stepping out, going on a walk, to like kind of stepping in and like really reconnecting with like why it is you do what you do, which I think resonates with some of what Oliver was saying. So I think it kind of varies across people's experiences and roles and situations. So maybe, and I think this might be discussed in the later workshops today, but I guess it's taking a bit of time perhaps for us to think to ourselves, like, what for me makes me feel better, and kind of having a bit of a toolkit that in difficult times you can then reach into, and it's kind of personal to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's really essential in this work to have that toolkit. And I totally take on board what Oliver said as well. You know, there are systemic changes which have to happen. But in the meantime, yes, let's not put too much weight on the bridge, and let's know what we can move towards in order to keep ourselves feeling well. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, because it's going to be different for all of us. You know, mindfulness, for example, doesn't work for everybody. You know, some people like to go for a nice run or something like that instead. So another question on here, we've got just 5 minutes, haven't we? So let's see if we can just get another one in. If lots of organisations and services are committed to a PI approach and provide access to reflective practice and have access to employee assistant interventions, why do you think we're still seeing record numbers of burnt out staff? And I think probably we've spoken to this in various ways already in terms of the sort of the wider societal structural issues that we're facing. Yeah, I don't know. Does anyone want to answer or add to anything they've said already relating to that? Although someone's sort of answered the next bit down, another audience member has said the lack of resources, very little training. There's so much focus on helping clients whilst forgetting about their staff.
Yeah, and I was going to say, and I think there are different things we can do, and there's that it feels like we've come a long way with sort of reflective practice and things, but it is still really challenging times. And I think also in just during sort of the 2019 sort of pandemic, where services, we had to just keep going, and I think people are tired. So I think it's just from observations, it feels like that it's just an accumulation of that, and that, you know, sort of services sort of kept running. A lot of the frontline workers, they didn't work from home, they were still out there sort of people are tired.
I think it's a really good point, Kate. I think the pandemic has a lot to do with the high levels of burnout and the very high staff turnover, because, you know, as humans, there's a thing known as surge capacity. So if we're faced with something difficult, then we can actually, for a few weeks, a few months, actually operate at a higher level and have more resources to do so. But we're bodies essentially, and bodies and brains need to rest. They need to rest, recover, reflect, and then you might be able to face another issue. But what's happened is we've had the pandemic, and then we've gone straight into the cost of living, and there really hasn't been that break. And I think, you know, I'm just garbling really. You're right, people are tired, people are exhausted and need a break. You know, I think that's really key. Rachel, you look like you might be about to say something there.
I guess I was just reflecting on some of the other questions which talk about kind of how to have this conversation and kind of create this conversation if it's not already going in people's organizations. And I was just thinking, we had, for example, one group that undertook some training through the training fund at St. Lions Charity, and they were specifically looking at kind of resilience, and that I think gave them some language and ideas and tools that they could then bring to their organization and kind of a way forward. So I guess I know we haven't got much time to kind of end with these. There are practical resources out there, whether it's the training fund or whether it's some of the tools that we're going to be talking about later this afternoon, that people can use to bring these issues to kind of attention and start to make progress on them within their organizations.
Yeah, thank you. And talking about what you're going through and having a framework to understand it is really key. And most approaches to dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder are exactly that, is enabling the person to add a narrative, a framework, and understanding, and be able to speak to what's going on for them. And I think that's what we're talking here about, bringing people together, having that validation as well, and understanding, oh gosh, you're going through this too, and bringing together our resources is really important.
Yeah, I was just going to say really quickly, if that's okay, Brett. So
Yes,
I know
please.
I've been probably quite defeatist, and I hope that hasn't come across too much. But I think the burnout question is a really important one, and I think any behaviour, most behaviour is a sign of unmet need. And I think in terms of organisations, a lot of people on the front line do two things. And I'm not, stereotyping, but people on the front line tend to keep things to themselves, and people tend to want to fix everything. And that combination can lead to very, very tired people. So, and that is in addition to a broken system that doesn't fund or procure or commission properly. So for me, I think one of the reasons staff burnout is still happening at quite high numbers, if we forget about the big context for now, is actually we need to make sure that our organisational cultures are safe for people to share their worries and their troubles, and that's a lot of what has been talked about today. And I just want to kind of finish, I suppose, by saying there's a few comments in there about someone's just flashed up to say, don't agonise, organise and join a union. And yeah, absolutely. For me, it's about connecting the work people do on the ground at the front line all the way up to people in the shining palaces of Westminster who are making decisions. We need to make that connection so things are not in isolation and we are not powerless. We live in a country where we can make a difference and actually have an impact. We do have hope, we do have options, we do have choices. So I think, yeah, anyone who's feeling burnt out at the moment, please don't lose hope and organise and get behind people and march with banners and vote and challenge and do all of that, because that's the only way we'll make any real change.
Thank you so much, Oliver. And apologies, we've run over by a minute. So just to say thank you very much to Kate, to Rachel, to Oliver, and also Josh, who's been doing the work behind the scenes, and also for everybody who's joined us for this conversation. I hope you continue having these conversations amongst your own teams and later today. And just to let you know, there's a break now for 20 minutes until 3:20, and there are other topics on resilience, mindfulness and boundaries that you can tap into this afternoon, and I would invite you to do so. So thank you very much for your time. Lovely to see you all.